The Welcome to Millbrook sign looked smaller than I remembered, its faded paint and rusted edges a stark reminder of how long I'd been away. 3 years. 3 years since I'd driven down these familiar streets, past Henderson's hardware with its crooked awning, and the old Lutheran church where I'd spent countless Sunday mornings fidgeting in starched dresses. Now, at 23, I was finally coming home, but only because death had summoned me back. "You okay, sweetheart?" Mom's voice pulled me from my thoughts. Sarah Dawson had always been my anchor in rough seas, and today her presence in the passenger seat was the only thing keeping me from turning the car around and driving straight back to Chicago. "I'm fine," I lied, gripping the steering wheel tighter as we passed the old Miller farm. The truth was, my stomach had been churning since we'd crossed the county line. Coming back to Millbrook meant facing him, my father, Charles Dawson, the man who'd written me off 3 years ago when I chose art school over the family real estate business. The funeral home sat at the end of Main Street like a somber period at the end of a sentence. Morrison and Sons Funeral Parlor had been burying Millbrook's residents for 4 generations, and today it would be laying my grandmother Margaret to rest. As I pulled into the parking lot, I could see the black sedans and pickup trucks of my extended family already assembled. My hands started trembling. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if the story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emily, Mom reached over and squeezed my shoulder. "Grandma Margaret would be so proud of you. Remember that." I nodded, though my throat felt too tight to speak. Margaret Dawson had been the one constant source of unconditional love in my life. While my father saw my artistic ambitions as a betrayal of family tradition, Grandma had always encouraged me to follow my heart. Even when money got tight during my second year at the Art Institute, somehow I'd managed to scrape together tuition through a combination of work-study programs and what I'd assumed were need-based scholarships. The funeral home's heavy oak doors opened with a creak that seemed to echo through time. Inside, the familiar faces of my childhood turned toward me, some with genuine sympathy, others with thinly veiled curiosity about the prodigal granddaughter who had dared to return. And there he was. Charles Dawson stood near the guest book, his silver hair perfectly styled, his black suit impeccable as always. At 58, my father commanded attention without trying, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten their posture. He looked every inch the successful businessman he'd become, taking over Dawson Properties from his mother and expanding it into the largest real estate firm in 3 counties. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment time seemed suspended. His face remained impassive, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes, the only tell he'd ever had when emotions threatened to break through his carefully constructed facade. "Charles," Mom nodded curtly as we approached. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago, but their interactions still carried the chill of 1,000 unspoken grievances. "Sarah, Emily." His voice was neutral, professional, as if we were clients rather than his ex-wife and daughter. He extended his hand to me, a handshake, not a hug. Even at his own mother's funeral, Charles Dawson maintained proper boundaries. "Dad." The word felt foreign on my tongue. "I'm sorry about Grandma." "She was 91, he replied, as if that explained away any grief. "She lived a full life." Behind him, my Aunt Linda emerged from the viewing room, her sharp features pinched with what I'd learned to recognize as her permanent expression of dissatisfaction. At 55, Linda had never married, dedicating herself instead to a series of administrative jobs and an impressive collection of grievances against the world. "Well, well," she said, looking me up and down with obvious disapproval. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. I suppose art school teaches you to make dramatic entrances." "Linda." My Uncle David appeared at her shoulder, his gentle voice carrying a warning. At 52, he was the youngest of Margaret's 3 children and the only one who'd inherited her kind heart. "Today isn't the day for this." But Linda's eyes glittered with malice. "When is the day, David? When she bothers to visit for Christmas? Oh, wait, she didn't do that. When she calls to check on her grandmother? Oh, wait, she didn't do that either." Nathaniel, lounging against the far wall, a smirk playing across his features as he watched the drama unfold. At 25, Nate had perfected the art of creating chaos while maintaining plausible deniability. "Perhaps we should focus on celebrating Mother's life," Charles interjected, though his tone suggested this was more about avoiding a public scene than any genuine desire for family harmony. I made it through the viewing in a haze of condolences and half-remembered conversations with people who'd known me as a child but couldn't quite reconcile that girl with the woman I'd become. Margaret looked peaceful in her casket, wearing the blue dress she'd loved, her silver hair styled the way she'd worn it for as long as I could remember. I whispered a private goodbye, promising her I'd make her proud. Somehow. The funeral service the next morning was a blur of hymns and readings. Reverend Patterson delivered a eulogy that painted Margaret as a pillar of the community, a devoted mother and grandmother, a woman who'd built something lasting through her generosity and wisdom. What he didn't mention, what none of them seemed to understand, was that she'd also been my lifeline. The one person who'd believed in me when everyone else saw only disappointment. As we filed out of the church, Linda fell into step beside me. "I hope you're not planning to stay long," she said under her breath. "Some of us have been here all along, dealing with reality while you've been playing artist in the big city." "I'm staying as long as I need to," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "We'll see about that. Tomorrow's the will reading, you know. I imagine there will be some adjustments to your expectations." The next morning found us gathered in Grandma's dining room, the same space where I'd spent countless Sunday dinners, listening to her stories about the old days. The heavy oak table that had witnessed decades of family celebrations and arguments now served as the stage for what everyone seemed to expect would be a simple, straightforward division of a modest estate. Attorney Grace Williams sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her dark suit speaking to decades of handling family drama with professional composure. At 67, Grace had been Margaret's lawyer and friend for over 20 years. She had seen enough family dissolutions to know exactly what kind of powder keg she was sitting on. "Thank you all for coming," Grace began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who delivered countless wills to countless families. "I know this is difficult, but Margaret was very specific about her wishes. I intend to honor them exactly as she laid them out." Charles sat directly across from me, his expression unreadable. Linda had claimed the chair to his right, her fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wood. David sat quietly to my left, offering me a small, reassuring smile. Mom had positioned herself slightly behind my chair, a silent guardian against whatever was coming. Nathaniel slouched in his seat near the window, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. His dark hair was uncombed, his shirt wrinkled, and I could see the impatience radiating from him in waves. Nate had always lived in a state of perpetual expectation that the world owed him something, and today he clearly expected that debt to be paid. Before we begin with the specific bequests, I want you all to understand that Margaret spent considerable time crafting this will. Every decision was carefully considered, and every allocation reflects her deepest convictions about this family. Something in her tone sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't going to be the simple, predictable reading everyone expected. "First, the personal items," Grace said, consulting her documents. "To Charles, Margaret leaves her collection of antique books, with the hope that he'll remember the stories she used to read to him as a child." Charles nodded curtly. Books weren't valuable enough to get excited about. To Linda, she leaves her jewelry collection and the china service, along with her hope that Linda will find joy and beauty rather than dwelling in bitterness. Linda's eyes narrowed at that last part, but she said nothing. To David, she leaves her garden tools and the small greenhouse out back, knowing he shares her love of growing things. David's eyes misted. She knew I always admired her roses. To Nathaniel, she leaves a personal letter, which I'll deliver to you privately. A letter? Nathaniel straightened in his chair. What about actual, valuable stuff? The letter contains her thoughts about your future. She felt it was more important than any material gift. I could see Nate's jaw working, his face flushing with anger. But Grace had already moved on. To Emily, she leaves her collection of art books, her easel, and her paint supplies, along with a note expressing her pride in Emily's courage to follow her dreams. My throat tightened. Even in death, Grandma was still encouraging me.
Now, Grace said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, we come to the matter of the house and the remaining estate. The room seemed to hold its breath. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the division of real assets. Grandma's house was worth at least $200,000, maybe more in today's market. Her savings account and investments would add another substantial sum. For a family that had never been wealthy, this represented a significant windfall. Linda leaned forward, her eyes bright with anticipation. Charles sat perfectly still, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. Even David seemed nervous, though he was trying to hide it. Margaret was very clear about her intentions, Grace continued, and something in her voice made my stomach drop. She wanted to ensure that her legacy went to the person who best embodied the values she held most dear. I leave my house at 412 Maple Street, Grace read, her voice steady despite the bomb she was about to drop, along with 55% of my remaining estate, to my granddaughter, Emily Sarah Dawson. The words hit the room like a physical force. Charles went rigid, his face a draining of color. Linda's mouth fell open in a way that would have been comical under different circumstances. Even David looked stunned. What? Linda's voice came out as a screech. That can't be right. But Grace wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, consulting the document, I want it known that for the past 3 years, I have been secretly supporting Emily's education through anonymous scholarships and financial aid using funds from my personal savings. The revelation landed like a second explosion. My mind reeled as puzzle pieces clicked into place. The mysterious scholarships that had appeared just when I needed them most. The grants I'd never quite understood how I'd qualified for. The way tuitions somehow became manageable year after year. You knew? Charles's voice was deadly quiet, his eyes locked on me. You knew she was giving you money that should have gone to the family? I didn't know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I thought they were need-based scholarships. I thought... You thought what? That you deserved special treatment? Linda was on her feet now, her face twisted with rage. While the rest of us scraped by, while David had to take out a second mortgage on his house, while I worked double shifts to help pay for mother's care, you were living it up in art school on our money? It wasn't your money, David said quietly, but his voice carried across the room. It was Mother's money to do with as she pleased. Don't you dare take her side, she whirled on him. She's been manipulating Mother for years, filling her head with stories about her artistic dreams while the rest of us dealt with reality. Charles stood slowly, his movement controlled but menacing. This will is clearly the result of undue influence. An elderly woman, confused and isolated, manipulated by a granddaughter who understood exactly how to play on her emotions. I never manipulated anyone, I said, finding my voice at last. I visited when I could. I called every week. I wrote letters. Letters, Nathan spat from his corner. He'd been silent during the initial shock, but now his voice dripped with venom. Probably filled with lies about how hard life was, how much you needed help, how nobody understood your artistic vision. That's not... What about me? Nate continued, rising from his chair. I'm family too. I've been here my whole life, and what do I get? A letter? A fucking letter while little Miss Art School gets a house? Nathaniel, Grace said firmly, her grandmother's letter explains her reasoning regarding your portion of the estate. I suggest you read it before making any judgments. But Nate was beyond reason. His face was flushed, his hands clenched into fists. This is bullshit, total bullshit. I'm her grandson too. I've been here through everything. Her health scares, her loneliness, helping with yard work when no one else would, and she leaves me a letter? Perhaps if you'd shown her the respect she deserved instead of only appearing when you needed money, Mom said icily, she might have felt differently about your character. The room erupted. Linda and Charles both started talking at once, their voices rising to compete with Nathaniel's continued profanity. David tried to play peacekeeper, his gentle voice lost in the chaos. I sat frozen in my chair, overwhelmed by the hurricane of anger swirling around me. This will is a joke, Linda declared. Mother was clearly not in her right mind when she made these decisions. We'll contest it, naturally. No court in the world would uphold such obvious manipulation. The will is perfectly legal, Grace said, raising her voice to be heard. Margaret was examined by her doctor just 2 months ago and declared completely competent. She understood exactly what she was doing.
Then she was being manipulated, Charles said coldly. His eyes found mine across the table, and the hatred I saw there made me flinch. My daughter has always been good at playing the victim, at making people feel sorry for her. Apparently, she found a way to weaponize that talent. How dare you? Mom stood up, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. How dare you accuse Emily of manipulation when you're the one who cut your own daughter off for following her dreams instead of your selfish plans? My selfish plans? Charles laughed, but there was no humor in it. I offered her a future in a stable, profitable business. Instead, she chose to waste her life on finger painting and sculptures that no one will ever buy. At least she chose something she cared about, Mom shot back. When was the last time you did anything that wasn't calculated to make you richer or more important? Enough, Linda interjected. The point is, this will is ridiculous, and we're going to fight it. Emily doesn't deserve 55% of anything. She abandoned this family the moment she left for Chicago. I didn't abandon anyone, I said, finally finding my voice again. I made a choice about my education, and Dad disowned me for it. I've been trying to build a life ever since. A life built on lies, Nathaniel said. A life subsidized by money that should have been helping the people who actually stayed. The accusations kept coming, wave after wave of anger and resentment that had clearly been building for years. They painted me as a manipulator, a con artist, a selfish girl who'd played on an old woman's emotions to secure her future at their expense. With each word, I felt smaller, more guilty, more convinced that maybe they were right. But then I remembered the phone calls with Grandma, her voice lighting up when I'd tell her about my latest project or a professor who'd praised my work. I remembered the letters she'd sent, full of encouragement and pride. I remembered the way she'd always believed in me, even when I didn't believe in myself. She loved me, I said quietly, and somehow my soft words cut through the shouting. Love. Is that what you call it? An old woman so desperate for attention that she'd bankrupt herself for the granddaughter who bothered to write pretty letters? That's exactly what I call it, I said, standing up to face them all. And maybe if any of you had shown her the same kind of love, instead of just waiting around for her to die so you could divide up her things, she might have made different choices. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles's face had gone from pale to red, his jaw working as if he was physically restraining himself from saying something he'd regret. Linda looked like she'd been slapped. Even Nathaniel seemed momentarily stunned by my words. Well, Grace said into the quiet, that concludes today's reading. If anyone wishes to contest the will, they're certainly free to do so. But I should warn you that Margaret anticipated this possibility. She left very detailed explanations for her decisions, along with character testimonies from several people who knew her well. As the family began to file out, muttering amongst themselves and shooting dark looks in my direction, Charles stopped beside my chair. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice pitched so only I could hear. "You may have fooled an old woman, but you won't fool a judge. We'll see you in court, Emily, and when this is all said and done, you'll wish you'd never come back to Millbrook." I watched him leave, followed by Linda and Nathaniel, their heads already together as they began plotting their next move. Only David lingered, his face troubled, but not angry. "Emily, I want you to know, Mother talked about you a lot. She was proud of you. Whatever happens next, don't let them make you forget that." Then he was gone too, leaving me alone with Mom and Grace Williams in the suddenly quiet dining room that had witnessed the complete destruction of whatever family bonds might have remained. "Well," Grace said, gathering her papers, "that went about as well as I expected." The aftermath of the will reading played out like a slow-motion car crash. What had started as shock and anger in Grandma's dining room quickly metastasized into something far more vicious once the family regrouped in the living room. I should have left then, should have grabbed my mom's hand and walked out the door. Instead, I found myself trapped in the center of a circle that felt like a tribunal than a family gathering. "I want to know exactly how you did it," Charles said, settling into Grandma's old recliner like he was claiming a throne. His voice had taken on the calculated tone he used during business negotiations, and I realized with growing dread that he saw this as just another deal to be won or lost. "I didn't convince her of anything," I said, hating how defensive I sounded. "I had no idea she was sending me money. I thought those scholarships were legitimate." "Oh, please. You expect us to believe you never wondered why you kept getting these mysterious grants? You never questioned why tuition kept getting easier to manage? You're not stupid, Emily, even if you made stupid choices."
What's that supposed to mean? It means, Linda continued, her voice dripping with venom, that while you were playing artist in Chicago, the rest of us were dealing with reality. I've been working 60-hour weeks for the past 5 years, taking care of Mother when she got sick, handling her doctor appointments, managing her medications. David mortgaged his house to help pay for her care when Medicare wouldn't cover everything. Charles has been running her business affairs and making sure she didn't fall victim to scams or predatory salespeople. And what were you doing? Charles picked up the thread seamlessly. Calling once a week to chat about your latest pottery project, writing letters about your feelings. Meanwhile, we were here, doing the actual work of being a family. Each word felt like a physical blow. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of support, but found only cold faces and accusing eyes. Even David, who'd shown me kindness at the funeral home, was staring at his hands, unable or unwilling to meet my gaze. "That's not fair," I said weakly. "I wanted to visit more, but I was working 3 jobs just to survive, and Dad made it clear I wasn't welcome here anyway." "Don't you dare blame this on me," Charles's composure cracked for the first time, his voice rising. "I offered you a place in the family business. I offered you stability, a future, a chance to contribute something meaningful. Instead, you chose to waste your life on finger painting and sculpture and somehow convinced my mother that your selfishness was actually noble. My dreams aren't selfish." "Dreams?" Nathaniel had been pacing by the window, but now he whirled around to face me. "You call it dreams? I call it manipulation. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? Poor little Emily, so misunderstood, so broke, so in need of help. You played the victim card better than anyone I've ever seen." "That's enough," Mom finally spoke up from her position near the doorway. I'd almost forgotten she was there, but now she stepped forward, her small frame somehow commanding the room's attention. You all need to listen to yourselves. Emily didn't manipulate anyone. If anything, Margaret saw what the rest of you couldn't. A granddaughter with talent and courage who was willing to work for her dreams instead of just expecting them to be handed to her. Stay out of this, Sarah, Charles warned. This is family business. Emily is my daughter, which makes it my business, Mom shot back. And frankly, I'm disgusted by what I'm seeing here. Your mother left Emily that money and that house because she believed in her. Because Emily called her every week not to ask for money, but to share her life. Because Emily wrote letters telling her about her art, her professors, her struggles and triumphs. When was the last time any of you did that? We were here, Linda said through gritted teeth. We were physically present, dealing with the day-to-day reality of caring for an aging parent. Were you? Mom's voice was deadly quiet. Or were you just going through the motions, waiting for the payoff? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Margaret saw right through all of you. The room erupted again, but this time the anger was directed at both of us. Charles stood up, his face flushed with rage, and for a moment I thought he might actually hit something. Linda was shouting about ungrateful ex-daughter-in-laws and manipulative gold diggers. Nathaniel kept repeating, "This is bullshit," like a broken record. Through it all, David remained silent, but I could see the war playing out on his face. He kept opening his mouth as if to speak, then closing it again, torn between family loyalty and whatever his conscience was telling him. You know what the real tragedy is here? Mom continued, her voice cutting through the chaos. Margaret probably hoped this inheritance would bring the family together, help you all see what really matters. Instead, you're proving exactly why she made the choice she did. You're more concerned with counting money than honoring her memory. Don't lecture us about Margaret's memory, Charles said, his voice dangerously low. You weren't here. You don't know what we went through, what we sacrificed. What did you sacrifice, Charles? Mom asked from where she sat. It looks like you sacrificed your relationship with your daughter for your pride, and now you're willing to sacrifice your mother's final wishes for your greed. That did it. Charles took a step toward Mom, his hands clenched into fists, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Real, uncontrolled rage breaking through his businessman facade. Get out, he said quietly. Both of you, get out of my mother's house. It's not your house, I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. According to the will, it's mine. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something colder, more calculating. We'll see about that, he said finally. Linda, call Richardson and Associates in the morning. We're going to contest this will, and we're going to tear apart every single decision Mother made in the last 5 years. By the time we're done, everyone in this town will know exactly what kind of person Emily really is.
Charles, David spoke up for the first time, his voice uncertain. Maybe we should think about this. Mother was always sharp. Right up until the end. If she wanted Emily to have the house, she was manipulated, Linda cut him off. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not as smart as I thought. Nathaniel stopped his pacing and turned to me with a smile that made my blood run cold. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into, he said. This is a small town, Emily. People talk, and by the time I'm done talking, everyone will know that Margaret Dawson's sweet little granddaughter is nothing but a con artist who took advantage of a lonely old woman. Nate, David started to protest, but Nathaniel held up a hand. No, Uncle David. She wants to play hardball? Let's play hardball. I know people in this town. People who work at the bank, people who knew Grandma, people who've been wondering how Emily could afford art school when her own father cut her off. I think they'll be very interested to learn the truth. The threat hung in the air like poison gas. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't going to be a simple legal dispute. This was going to be character assassination, a systematic destruction of my reputation and Grandma's memory. They were going to turn me into a villain to justify their greed. "Come on, Emily," Mom said quietly, taking my arm. "We're leaving." As we walked toward the door, Charles called out behind us, "You've got 24 hours to think about this, Emily. 24 hours to do the right thing and disclaim your inheritance. After that, we file the contest, and this gets ugly. Uglier than you can imagine." I paused at the threshold, looking back at the room where I'd spent so many happy childhood hours. Grandma's furniture, her photographs, her careful decorations, all of it felt tainted now by the hatred filling the space. "I loved her," I said quietly. "Whatever you think of me, whatever you believe about my motives, I loved Grandma Margaret, and I'm not going to let you destroy her memory to get your hands on her money." "Then you've made your choice," Charles replied. "Don't say I didn't warn you." That evening, I found myself alone in Grandma's house for the first time since arriving in Millbrook. Mom had gone back to the motel to make some phone calls, checking on her job, she had said, though I suspected she was also researching lawyers. The silence felt overwhelming after the day's confrontations, broken only by the familiar sounds of the old house settling and the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with its steady tick. I wandered through the rooms like a ghost, touching familiar objects and trying to reconcile the loving grandmother I remembered with the woman who'd apparently been orchestrating my financial support for years without telling me. Everything looked exactly the same. The worn chintz sofa where we'd read books together, the kitchen table where she taught me to make her famous chocolate chip cookies, the window seat where I'd curled up in during thunderstorms while she told me stories about her own childhood. But now I was seeing it all through different eyes. Had she been planning this for years? Had every conversation, every shared moment been building toward this final gift that would tear the family apart? I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Grandma's bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The room smelled like her, lavender and old paper and the faint trace of the vanilla candle she had loved. Her bed was neatly made, the quilt she had sewn herself decades ago still draped across the foot. On impulse, I walked to her old writing desk by the window, the desk where she'd written me all those encouraging letters, where she'd managed the household finances, where she'd apparently made the decision to secretly support my education. The top was clear except for a small stack of mail and her reading glasses, but I knew Grandma well enough to know she kept important things in the drawers. The first drawer stuck a little, it always had, but opened to reveal the usual collection of pens, stamps, and paper clips. The second drawer, however, made my breath catch. It was filled with letters, dozens of them, all in my handwriting. Every letter I'd ever sent her, carefully organized by date and tied with ribbon. I pulled out one of the bundles and saw my own words from 2 years ago, describing a particularly challenging sculpture class and my professor's encouragement to enter a student exhibition. Underneath the letters, I found something that made my hands shake. A manila folder labeled Emily's Education in Grandma's careful script. Inside were copies of scholarship applications, applications I'd never seen before, applications that had been submitted on my behalf with my personal information, but not my signature. Applications to the Margaret Dawson Arts Foundation and the Millbrook Community Education Fund, organizations that I was beginning to realize probably existed only on paper. There were bank records, too, showing regular transfers from Grandma's savings account to these fictitious foundations and then to my school's financial aid office. Thousands of dollars, year after year, all carefully documented and legally transferred. Whatever else my family might say about the situation, Grandma had been methodical and transparent about her support, at least in her own records. At the bottom of the folder, I found a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Grandma's shaking handwriting. My heart pounded as I opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside.
My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered my secret. I hope you won't be angry with me for not telling you about the scholarships.
I knew you were too proud to accept direct help, and I wanted you to believe in your own capabilities. But I also knew that pride shouldn't keep you from pursuing your dreams. I want you to understand why I made the choices I did, both with your education and with my will. Over the years, I've watched my children become people I don't recognize. Charles is so focused on money and status that he's forgotten how to love unconditionally. Linda has let bitterness consume her until she can't see any good in the world. Even David, sweet as he is, has learned to avoid conflict rather than standing up for what's right. But you, my darling girl, you kept the best parts of yourself despite everything. You chose to pursue something beautiful instead of something profitable. You called me not because you had to, but because you wanted to. You shared your struggles and your victories with equal honesty. You reminded me that there's still magic in the world, still reason to hope. The house and the money aren't rewards for being my favorite, though I won't lie and say you aren't. They're investments in the future, in the kind of person I hope will carry on the best parts of our family legacy. I know the others will be angry. I know they'll say terrible things about you and about me, but I also know you're strong enough to weather the storm and wise enough to use what I've given you for good. Don't let them make you feel guilty for dreaming, Emily. Don't let them convince you that love is a limited resource that has to be earned through suffering. You've already earned everything I've given you simply by being the kind, creative, courageous young woman I'm proud to call my granddaughter. All my love, Grandma Margaret. P.S. Check the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser. There's something there I've been saving for you. I was crying by the time I finished the letter. Tears of grief and gratitude and overwhelming love for the woman who'd believed in me when no one else would. The family's accusations felt even more painful now, knowing how much thought and care had gone into Grandma's decisions. This wasn't the whim of a confused elderly woman. It was the final act of someone who'd spent years watching her family and making difficult decisions based on what she'd observed. With shaking hands, I walked to the old dresser and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small wooden box I'd never seen before. I lifted it carefully and found a tiny latch on the front. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, all of me at different ages. Me as a toddler finger painting at the kitchen table, me at 7 proudly holding up a crayon drawing of our house, me at 15 covered in clay from a pottery class. Pictures I didn't even know she'd taken, moments I'd forgotten, but she'd preserved. But at the bottom of the box was something that took my breath away. A photograph of a young woman I didn't recognize at first, standing in front of an easel, paintbrush in hand, smiling at the camera with joy and determination. She looked to be about my age, with dark hair and familiar eyes. It took me a moment to realize who it was. Grandma! Grandma Margaret as a young woman, probably in her early 20s, pursuing her own artistic dreams. I'd never known she'd been an artist. She'd never mentioned painting or drawing, never shown me any of her work. Had she given up her art for marriage, for children, for the practical demands of life? Had she seen in me a chance to nurture the dreams she'd had to abandon? I turned the photograph over and found an inscription in faded ink. Margaret Sullivan, 1952, following my heart. Sullivan? Her maiden name, from before she'd married Grandpa and become a Dawson. Suddenly, everything made more sense. The art books she'd left me, the encouragement she'd always given my creative pursuits, the way her eyes had lit up when I'd described my classes and projects. She hadn't just been supporting my education, she'd been living vicariously through my artistic journey, experiencing through me the dreams she'd never been able to fully realize herself. I sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of her love and her secrets, and felt something shift inside me. The guilt I'd been carrying since the will reading began to transform into something else. Determination, maybe, or righteous anger. My family could say whatever they wanted about my motives or my character. They could drag me through court and turn the whole town against me.
But they couldn't change the truth of what Grandma and I had shared, and they couldn't make me ashamed of being loved. The next morning brought a phone call that shattered any hope I'd harbored for a peaceful resolution. I was sitting in Grandma's kitchen, drinking coffee, and trying to process everything I'd discovered the night before when the phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock. Amelia Dawson. The voice was crisp, professional, and unfamiliar. Yes? This is Richard Patterson from Richardson and Associates. I represent your father and aunt in the matter of Margaret Dawson's will. I'm calling to inform you that my clients intend to file a formal contest of the will by end of business today, alleging undue influence and mental incapacity. My coffee cup trembled in my hands. Mental incapacity? Grandma was sharp as a tack right up until she died. That will be for the court to determine. However, I wanted to extend one final opportunity for you to resolve this matter out of court. If you're willing to disclaim your inheritance and allow
an equal distribution of the estate among the surviving children, my clients are prepared to drop all legal challenges. And if I don't? Patterson's voice took on a harder edge. Then we'll proceed with a full investigation of your relationship with the deceased, including a thorough examination of your financial records, your communications with Mrs. Dawson, and your influence over her decision-making in the final years of her life. I should warn you that such proceedings can be quite invasive and public. Small towns do love their gossip. The threat was barely veiled. They were going to drag my name through the mud, paint me as a manipulative gold digger who'd taken advantage of a lonely old woman. In a town like Millbrook, reputation was everything, and once destroyed, it could never be fully repaired. I need time to think, I said. You have until 5 o'clock today. After that, the paperwork gets filed and this becomes a public matter. The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and wondering how my life had spiraled so completely out of control in just 3 days. 20 minutes later, Grace Williams arrived at the front door, her expression grim but determined. I heard about Patterson's call, she said without preamble. Small-town lawyers talk, and he's been bragging about taking me on since yesterday afternoon. Is he good? Grace smiled grimly. He's competent, expensive, and completely without scruples. Exactly the kind of lawyer your father would hire. But, Emily, I need you to understand something. This will is absolutely legal. I witnessed Margaret's signature myself, and I can testify to her mental state. She knew exactly what she was doing and why. But can they win? They can make it expensive and ugly, Grace admitted. They'll drag this out for months, maybe years. They'll depose everyone who knew Margaret, including you. They'll try to paint her as a confused old woman and you as a master manipulator. It'll cost you thousands in legal fees, assuming you can even find the money to fight them. My heart sank. I had maybe $3,000 in my checking account and a credit card that was already maxed out from school expenses. I couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle with the family's resources. There's something else, Grace continued. I stopped by the diner this morning for coffee, and I heard Nathaniel holding court at the corner booth. He's been busy spreading his version of events. According to him, you've been plotting this for years, slowly poisoning Margaret's mind against the rest of the family, while secretly taking her money. That's not true. I know that, and you know that, but the people who matter for your reputation in this town don't know that. They just know that the granddaughter who rarely visited suddenly inherited most of the estate, and that doesn't sit well with folks who value loyalty to family above everything else. I felt trapped, caught between impossible choices. If I fought the will contest, I'd be bankrupt before it was over, my reputation destroyed, and my life in Millbrook, if I even wanted one, ruined beyond repair. If I gave in and disclaimed the inheritance, I'd be betraying Grandma's trust and letting greed win over love. What would you do? I asked Grace. She was quiet for a long moment,
studying my face. 20 years ago, when I was starting my practice, I had a case that could have made my career. A big corporate client, lots of money, lots of prestige. The only problem was that I knew they were in the wrong. I had to choose between success and integrity. What did you choose? Integrity. I lost the case, lost the client, and spent the next 5 years struggling to build my reputation back up. But I've never regretted it, not once. She paused, then added, Margaret chose you for a reason, Emily. She saw something in you that reminded her of her younger self, something worth investing in. The question is, do you see it too? After Grace left, I found myself back in Grandma's bedroom, staring at the photograph of her as a young artist. Had she faced a similar choice at some point? Had she been forced to choose between her dreams and family expectations, between following her heart and keeping the peace? I thought about the letters she'd left me, about the years of secret support, about the faith she had in my abilities and my character. She knew this moment would come. She knew her decision would spark a war, and she'd chosen to trust me to weather it. The phone rang again at 4:30. This time, it was Uncle David. His voice strained and apologetic. Emily, I wanted to call before everything gets filed. I want you to know that I don't agree with what Charles and Linda are doing. Then why aren't you stopping them?
Because I can't, he said quietly. You don't understand how they are when they set their minds to something. They'll destroy me too if I get in their way, and I can't afford that right now. Karen's been out of work for 6 months, and we're barely keeping our heads above water as it is. So you're just going to let them destroy me instead? I'm going to try to stay neutral, he said, though he sounded miserable about it. I won't testify against you, but I can't testify for you either. I'm sorry, Emily. I know it's not enough, but it's all I can do. At 4:55, 5 minutes before Patterson's deadline, I made my decision. I called his office and left a simple message with his secretary. Tell Mr. Patterson that Emily Dawson declines his client's offer. If they want to contest my grandmother's will, they're welcome to try. Then I sat in Grandma's living room, surrounded by her photographs and her memories, and prepared for war. The next morning's Millbrook Gazette carried a front-page story about the will contest, complete with speculation about family discord and questions about the deceased's final wishes. By noon, I'd received 3 phone calls from neighbors expressing their concern about the situation, 2 visits from people who claimed they were just checking on me, and 1 particularly unpleasant encounter with Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, who made sure to tell me loudly enough for everyone to hear that some people have no shame about taking advantage of family. But I also found an unexpected ally. Mrs. Chen, who'd lived next door to Grandma for 15 years, appeared at my door with a casserole and a fierce expression. I don't believe a word of what they're saying about you. Margaret talked about you all the time, showed me your letters, bragged about your art shows. She was proud of you, not confused by you. Thank you, I said, feeling tears threaten again. That cousin of yours came by my house yesterday, trying to get me to say Margaret was getting senile. I told him where he could stick his questions. Mrs. Chen's eyes flashed with indignation. You fight them, honey. Fight them hard. Margaret would expect nothing less. As I closed the door behind her, I realized something had changed in me. The scared, guilty girl who'd sat through yesterday's accusations was gone. In her place was someone harder, more determined, someone who'd inherited more than money and property from Grandmother Dawson, someone who'd inherited her strength. They wanted a fight. They were going to get one. 3 days after the legal papers were filed, I learned exactly how far Nathaniel was willing to go to get what he believed he deserved. I had been spending my evenings at Grandma's house, going through her belongings and trying to understand the full scope of her life and her choices. It was therapeutic in a way. Each photograph, each saved letter, each carefully preserved memento helped me feel closer to her and more certain about my decision to fight.
That's why I was there at 9 o'clock on Thursday night when I heard the back door creak open. My blood turned to ice. I was alone in the house, Mom having returned to Chicago that morning to handle work obligations and give me space to figure things out. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Chen, but her house was dark and I doubted she could hear me if I screamed. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, my heart hammering so hard I was sure whoever was in the house could hear it. The back door stood open, letting in the cool October air, and I could hear someone moving around in Grandma's study. "I know you're in there," I called out, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I've already called the police." The sound stopped abruptly, followed by a string of curses that made me recognize the intruder's voice immediately. "God damn it, Emily! You scared the shit out of me!" Nathaniel emerged from the study, his hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled like he'd been drinking. In his hands was one of Grandma's photo albums, and I could see papers scattered across her desk behind him. "What the hell are you doing in here, Nate? What does it look like I'm doing? Looking for evidence." He held up the photo album like it was a weapon. "Evidence that you've been manipulating Grandma for years, playing the perfect granddaughter while the rest of us dealt with real life." "Get out." I kept my phone in my hand, finger poised over the emergency call button. "Go ahead," he sneered. "Call them. Tell them how the grieving grandson was just trying to understand why his grandmother cut him out of her will. Tell them how the sweet little artist is hoarding family memories while the rest of us get nothing." "You didn't get nothing. You got a letter." "A letter!" Nate threw the photo album down and I flinched as it hit the hardwood floor, photographs scattering everywhere. "A fucking letter telling me to make something of myself using dead money from my grandmother I'd never met?"
And find my own path. Do you know what that's worth? Nothing. Less than nothing. Because it's a reminder that my own grandmother thought I was worthless. That's not what it meant. Don't. His voice was raw with anger and something that might have been pain. Don't you dare tell me what my grandmother meant. You weren't here, Emily. You don't know what it was like, watching her get weaker, watching her mind start to go. Her mind didn't go anywhere. She was sharp until the end. Was she? Nate stepped closer, and I could smell the alcohol on his breath. Because the grandmother I knew would never have given everything to someone who abandoned the family. The grandmother I knew cared about the people who stuck around, who helped her with yard work and drove her to doctor appointments and listened to the same stories over and over again. I didn't abandon anyone. Dad disowned me, remember? Because you chose art school over family. Because you decided your precious dreams were more important than loyalty. Nate's face was flushed, his eyes bright with fury. And somehow, you convinced her that selfishness was actually noble. I stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how deep his bitterness ran. This wasn't just about money. It was about validation, about feeling chosen and valued. Nathaniel had spent years expecting that his physical presence would be rewarded, that showing up would matter more than anything else. Learning that Grandma had valued my letters and phone calls over his yard work had shattered something fundamental in his worldview. "Nate," I said more gently, "Grandma loved you. Whatever her reasons for the will, it wasn't because she didn't love you." "Then why?" The question came out broken, vulnerable, and for a moment he looked less like a threatening intruder and more like a lost little boy. "Why didn't I matter enough? I was here, Emily. I was always here." Being physically present isn't the same as being emotionally connected. When was the last time you had a real conversation with her? Not about money or chores or what she needed, but about who she was, what she dreamed about, what mattered to her. His face hardened again. "So this is my fault. I wasn't good enough at heart-to-heart talks, so I deserved to be cut out." "It's not about deserving anything. It's about connections, about understanding. Grandma saw something in me that reminded her of herself, of dreams she'd had to give up. She wanted to nurture that, to make sure I didn't have to sacrifice my art the way she did." "Her art?" He looked confused. "What art?"
Grandma wasn't an artist. I realized he didn't know. None of them knew about the photograph I'd found, about Margaret's own abandoned dreams. They'd only seen her as a mother, a grandmother, a caretaker, never as a person with her own lost ambitions and regrets. She was once. Before she got married, before she had children, she gave it up for family responsibilities, but she never forgot what it felt like to create something beautiful. Nate stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Doubt, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. Then he shook his head violently, as if trying to dislodge the uncomfortable thoughts. No, you don't get to rewrite history to make yourself the hero of this story. You manipulated a lonely old woman, and now you're trying to manipulate me with some bullshit story about her secret artistic soul. It's not a story, Nate. I have proof. Proof of what? That you're good at making up fairy tales? That you convinced Grandma she was an artist so she'd relate to you better? He grabbed another photo album from the shelf and threw it across the room. You destroyed this family, Emily. You turned us against each other for money. I didn't turn anyone against anyone. You all did that yourselves when you decided greed was more important than love. Don't lecture me about love. You have no idea what love looks like in the real world, where people make sacrifices and stick around when things get hard instead of running off to chase dreams. I felt my own anger rising, hot and clean and righteous. You want to know what love looks like? It looks like calling someone every week to check on them, not because you have to, but because you care. It looks like sharing your struggles and triumphs because you want that person to be part of your life. It looks like believing in someone's dreams even when the rest of the world thinks they're foolish. And it looks like giving them all your money. It looks like supporting them however you can. Yes, even if that means keeping it secret so they don't feel guilty about accepting help. Nate laughed bitterly. You really believe that, don't you? You really think you were the victim in all this? The misunderstood artist who deserved special treatment?
I think I was someone who loved my grandmother and was loved by her in return. If that threatens you, that's your problem, not mine. For a moment, I thought he might hit me. His hands clenched into fists, his face contorted with rage and frustration. Then, suddenly, he seemed to deflate. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You can keep the house, keep the money, keep your precious validation. But you'll never really win, Emily, because everyone in this town will know what you really are, a selfish little girl who let an old woman buy her love." He pushed past me toward the back door, then paused on the threshold. "You know what the saddest part is? Grandma really did love you, but she'd have loved all of us. And you were too selfish to see that her love didn't have to be divided up like her money." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the scattered photographs and the echo of his words. I sank to my knees and began gathering up the pictures, my hands shaking as I tried to piece together the fragments of memories he'd destroyed in his rage. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was sweeping up the last of the broken glass from one of the photo frames Nathaniel had knocked over when Uncle David appeared at the front door, looking haggard and uncertain. "Emily, can I come in?" I hesitated, remembering his phone call about staying neutral, but something in his expression, a vulnerability I'd never seen before, made me step aside and let him enter. "I heard about what happened last night," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Chen saw Nate leaving through the backyard and called me. She was worried about calling the police without knowing the whole story." "It's fine. He didn't take anything, just made a mess and said some things." I gestured at the living room, where I'd spent the morning trying to restore order. "I'm cleaning it up." David winced. "Emily, I need to tell you something. Something I should have said days ago." He sat down heavily on Grandma's sofa, looking older than his 52 years. "I've been a coward. I let Charles and Linda bully me into staying quiet when I've always known, that Mother made the right choice. David, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." His voice was firm, more determined than I'd ever heard it. I've been thinking about what Nate said to you last night, about being here, about physical presence mattering more than emotional connection, and I realized something. He's wrong, but not in the way you might think. I sat down across from him, curious despite myself. I was here too, Emily. I helped with the yard work, drove her to appointments, made sure she was safe. But you know what I never did? I never asked her what she was thinking about when she sat in that garden for hours. I never asked about her dreams, her regrets, her hopes for the future. I was so busy taking care of her body that I forgot to take care of her soul. His words hung in the air between us, heavy with years of accumulated guilt. But you did, he continued. In every phone call, every letter, every conversation, you treated her like a complete person, not just an elderly relative to be managed. You asked about her garden because you wanted to know what brought her joy. You shared your art with her because you knew she'd appreciate the beauty of it. You gave her a reason to feel useful and valued, not just cared for. Tears were running down my cheeks now, but I couldn't speak. She told me, not about the money. She kept that secret from everyone. But she told me about your calls, about your letters. Her whole face would light up when she talked about your latest project or something funny you'd said. She said you made her feel young again, reminded her of possibilities instead of just limitations. Why are you telling me this now? David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Because I let fear make me a coward, and I'm tired of it. Because Charles and Linda are going to destroy you if someone doesn't stand up and tell the truth. And because Mother deserves to have at least one of her children defend the choice she made. What about your neutrality? What about keeping peace with your siblings? There is no peace, Emily. There hasn't been peace in this family for years. We've all been pretending, going through the motions of family gatherings and polite conversations, while resentment ate us alive from the inside. Mother saw that. She saw how we'd all gotten so focused on what we thought we deserved that we forgot to focus on what we could give. And now I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning. I'm going to testify on your behalf. I'm going to tell the court and anyone else who'll listen that Margaret Dawson was of sound mind when she made her will, and that her choice to support your education was consistent with the values she held her entire life.
He smiled sadly. They'll never forgive me anyway. Charles has been angry with me for years because I wouldn't join the business, wouldn't become another extension of his ambition. Linda resents me because I found love and happiness while she chose bitterness. This inheritance contest is just giving them an excuse to express what they've always felt. What about Karen, your family? I talked to Karen last night after Mrs. Chen called. You know what she said? She said it was about time I grew a spine and did the right thing instead of the safe thing. His smile became more genuine. She's been wanting to meet you properly for years. She said any young woman brave enough to choose art over money was someone she wanted in her corner. I started crying then, big, ugly sobs that I'd been holding back for days. David moved to sit beside me on the sofa and awkwardly patted my shoulder while I fell apart. I'm scared, I admitted when I could speak again. I'm scared they're going to destroy Grandma's memory, make her look like a confused old woman who was tricked by a manipulative granddaughter. They're going to try, David said honestly. But Emily, I knew my mother for 52 years. She was many things, stubborn, opinionated, sometimes judgmental, but she was never, ever confused. She made this choice because she believed in you, and she knew the rest of us had lost our way. What if I can't live up to what she believed about me? You already have. You could have taken the easy way out, disclaimed the inheritance, and gone back to Chicago. Instead, you're here, fighting for her memory and her wishes even when it would be easier to give up. That's exactly the kind of courage she saw in you.
We sat in silence for a while, surrounded by the evidence of Grandma's life and love. Finally, David spoke again. "There's something else I need to tell you about Mother's letter to Nate." I looked at him questioningly. "She showed it to me before she sealed it. She was worried about him, about the direction his life was taking. The letter wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be a wake-up call. She hoped that maybe, if he didn't get the easy inheritance he was expecting, he'd finally be motivated to make something meaningful of his life." "Do you think it worked?" David shook his head sadly. "I think it just made him angrier. But that's not your fault, Emily. You can't save people who don't want to be saved." The showdown came 2 weeks later, not in a courtroom as I'd expected, but in the same place where it all began, Grandma's dining room. Grace Williams had arranged what she diplomatically called a settlement conference, though everyone knew it was really a last-ditch attempt to avoid a public trial that would benefit no one except the lawyers. Charles arrived first, looking every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and gold watch. Linda came with him, her face set in lines of permanent disapproval. Nathaniel slouched in last, wearing sunglasses indoors and radiating hostility. Only David seemed nervous, fidgeting with his tie as we took our seats around the table that had witnessed so many family dinners and was now hosting our family's funeral. Grace sat at the head of the table again, but this time the atmosphere was different. This wasn't a ceremonial reading, this was war, conducted with polite words and legal threats. "Before we begin," Charles said, his voice carrying all the authority he'd built over decades in business, "I want Emily to understand exactly what she's facing if we proceed to trial. We've hired forensic accountants to examine every financial transaction Mother made in the last 5 years. We've interviewed dozens of people who knew her, including her doctor, her housekeeper, and her neighbors. We have evidence." "Evidence of what?" I interrupted, surprised by my own boldness. Charles smiled coldly. "Evidence that she was increasingly isolated, increasingly dependent on your phone calls and letters for social contact, that her judgment was compromised by loneliness, and a granddaughter who knew exactly how to exploit that loneliness for financial gain." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" Linda leaned forward, her eyes glittering with malice. "You called her every week, always at the same time, always when she was most vulnerable. You wrote her letters full of your struggles and your needs, making sure she knew exactly how much financial pressure you were under. You played the struggling artist perfectly, Emily. I'll give you that." The accusations hit like physical blows, but I'd been preparing for this moment ever since I'd made the decision to fight. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for 2 weeks. Copies of every letter Grandma had written to me, along with the photograph of her as a young artist. "You want to talk about evidence?" I said, my voice steady despite the rapid beating of my heart. "Let's talk about evidence." I spread the letters across the table, watching as my family's expressions shifted from confidence to confusion.